Billionaire saw his housekeeper's daughter defend his son from bullies. And what he did next stunned everyone. A tray wobbled. Milk sloshed dangerously close to the edge. Leo Vance's fingers trembled as whispers hissed across the cafeteria. "Careful, shaky," someone sneered. A laugh cut through the room, sharp as glass. Phones lifted, red dots blinking, waiting for him to fall. He wanted to vanish, but cruelty never misses its mark. Another shove, another snicker. The kind that leaves bruises no one can see. At the far table, a girl set down her fork. Quiet, steady, watching. "Are you all right?" she would soon ask, her voice soft but unshakable. And what started as another ordinary school lunch ended as something no one could have predicted. This is the story of how a billionaire's son, his housekeeper's daughter, and one moment of courage collided to change everything. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. He had all the money in the world, but not enough to buy his son a friend. That was the silent truth that haunted Harrison Vance as he signed another billion-dollar deal. In his sprawling mansion, his son, Leo, was the ghost at the feast of his own life. Leo Vance knew the weight of silence. At 11 years old, he had learned that a home could be as vast as a canyon and just as empty. His world was a fortress of polished marble, floor-to-ceiling glass, and priceless art that felt colder than stone. Each morning, a gourmet breakfast was laid out for him on a dining table that could seat 20. He always ate alone. His father, Harrison Vance, was a name whispered with awe in boardrooms across the globe. He was a titan of industry, a man who could move markets with a single phone call. He loved his son, but his love was expressed in stock portfolios and trust funds, not in shared laughter or bedtime stories. After Leo's mother, Eleanor, had passed away from a sudden illness 5 years prior, Harrison had buried his grief under a mountain of work. He provided everything a boy could ever want, except the one thing Leo truly needed, his time. Leo was a quiet boy, gentle and observant. He carried a small, invisible burden. A neurological condition from a childhood fever had left him with a persistent, slight tremor in his hands. It was barely noticeable to a stranger, but to the cruel eyes of children, it was a flaw to be magnified. He could not hold a pencil without a slight shake or carry a lunch tray without intense concentration. In a world that valued perfection, his hands betrayed him. His mother had understood. "Your hands shake, my love," Eleanor would say, her voice as soft as cashmere, "because your heart is too big for your body. All that kindness has to go somewhere." He held onto those words like a secret treasure, a shield against a world that did not have his mother's gentle eyes. At Northwood Preparatory Academy, that shield was tested every day. Northwood was not just a school. It was a kingdom for the children of the wealthy. Students arrived in chauffeured cars, their backpacks costing more than a monthly mortgage. Here, wealth was not just an advantage, it was armor. And Leo, despite being the son of one of the richest men in the country, walked through the gleaming halls unprotected. The tremor in his hands made him a target. Nicknames followed him like a shadow. Shaky Leo, Mr. Jitters. The taunts were rarely shouted. They were whispers, snickers behind cupped hands, just loud enough for him to hear. He learned to walk with his hands tucked into his pockets. He learned to shrink, to make himself smaller, hoping to become invisible. He would retreat to the quiet corners of the library during lunch, the pages of his books the only friends who didn't judge the unsteadiness of his grip. Across town, in a small, tidy apartment that could fit inside the Vance's grand ballroom, lived another 11-year-old who understood what it meant to be different. Grace Miller was a girl with hair the color of pale corn silk and eyes the color of a summer sky. Her world was not one of marble and glass, but of worn wooden furniture, the scent of her mother's fresh-baked bread, and the quiet hum of a life built on hard work and love. Her mother, Susan Miller, was a woman of immense grace and fortitude. She worked as the head housekeeper at the Vance mansion. Every day, she moved through the silent, opulent rooms, cleaning and polishing a life her own daughter could only imagine. Susan was a single mother, working tirelessly to give Grace a chance at a better future. That chance was a scholarship to Northwood Preparatory Academy, a place where Grace was an outsider from the moment she stepped onto the perfectly manicured campus. Grace did not carry the burden of wealth, but she carried a legacy of a different kind. In a small, polished wooden box on her dresser sat a collection of medals, a folded flag, and a stack of faded letters. They belonged to her great-grandfather, Sergeant Major Thomas Sarge Miller, a decorated war veteran who had been a legend in their small community. He had passed away when Grace was only 6, but his lessons were the bedrock of her existence. Her mother would read his letters to her, his firm, clear handwriting spelling out a code of honor. He never wrote about glory or victory. He wrote about duty, integrity, and the quiet strength of character. Courage isn't about being the strongest person in the room, one letter read. It's about being the one who stands up for what is right, especially when your knees are shaking. Never raise your hand in anger, Gracie. You raise it only to shield someone who cannot shield themselves. Grace absorbed these words. She was quiet at school, not out of shyness, but out of observation. She saw everything. She saw the girls who whispered about her secondhand shoes. She saw the boys who mocked her simple, homemade lunches. And she saw Leo Vance, the boy with the sad eyes and trembling hands, who ate alone in the library. She knew who he was. Sometimes, on weekends, her mother would have to work extra hours, and Grace would come along, sitting quietly in the vast kitchen of the Vance mansion, doing her homework. She would see Leo through the doorway, a solitary figure in a home that felt more like a museum. He never spoke to her, and she never spoke to him. They were two ghosts from different worlds, haunting the same spaces, each invisible in their own way. He was the boy who had everything but felt he had nothing. She was the girl who had little but felt she was rich in what mattered. Neither of them knew it, but their quiet, separate paths were about to collide in the one place where the school's cruelty was at its loudest, the cafeteria. The Northwood cafeteria was a spectacle. It gleamed under recessed lighting, the air filled with the smells of artisanal pizza and expensive coffee. It was less a lunchroom and more a social battlefield, where the unspoken rules of hierarchy were as rigid as the steel beams holding up the ceiling. At the center of this kingdom sat Chad Pennington III, and his court. Chad was the kind of boy who was born believing the world was his property. His family's name was on half the buildings in the city. He had a politician's smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. His two lieutenants, Blake and Kyle, were his shadows, always ready to echo his laughter or amplify his cruelty. They moved through the school with an untouchable arrogance, their path cleared by the fear and admiration of their peers. Leo, by his very existence, was an offense to Chad. He was richer than Chad, yet he did not act like it. He didn't boast. He didn't command attention. He shrank from it. This quietness, this perceived weakness, was something Chad could not tolerate. It was a challenge to his dominance. That Tuesday, the library was closed for inventory, forcing Leo into the bright, loud chaos of the cafeteria. He felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He found the smallest, most remote table in a corner, hoping to remain unseen. He placed his tray down with painstaking care, his knuckles white from the effort of keeping his hands steady. A carton of milk, a sandwich, and an apple. A simple meal for a boy who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. But Chad had seen him. He saw him as a hunter sees a deer that has wandered from the safety of the forest. This was an opportunity too perfect to waste. He sauntered over, Blake and Kyle flanking him. The low hum of the cafeteria began to dim as students sensed the shift in the social atmosphere. Phones, which were always at the ready, began to subtly angle toward Leo's table. Well, Chad began, his voice dripping with mock concern. Look who's gracing us with his presence. Taking a break from hiding, Vance. Leo kept his eyes fixed on his sandwich. He did not answer. He knew that any response was fuel. What's the matter? Chad leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. He looked directly at Leo's hands. Feeling a little shaky today? A few nervous snickers rippled from the surrounding tables. Leo's cheeks burned with shame. He curled his fingers into a fist under the table. Blake chimed in, a cruel grin spreading across his face. Careful, Chad. He might spill his milk. Wouldn't want to cause a natural disaster. The laughter grew louder. Leo's breath hitched. He just wanted to disappear. He risked a glance up and saw dozens of eyes on him, some filled with pity, most with morbid curiosity, waiting for the show to begin. In a far corner of the cafeteria, Grace Miller watched, her fork frozen over her container of rice and vegetables. She sat at the scholarship students' table, a small island of mismatched lunchboxes in a sea of catered meals. She had seen this happen before, to other kids. The whispers, the shoves, the casual cruelty that was the currency of Northwood's social life. But today it was different. Today it was Leo, the boy from the museum house, the boy with his mother's kind eyes. She heard her great-grandfather's voice in her head, as clear as if he were sitting beside her. You stand up for what is right, especially when your knees are shaking. Chad grew bolder, energized by the audience. He picked up one of Leo's textbooks from the table. Heavy book, he said, then pretended to lose his grip. The book crashed to the floor with a loud bang that made Leo jump. Oops, Chad said, his eyes wide with fake innocence. My hands must be slipping. The cafeteria howled with laughter. It was a chorus of casual contempt. Leo's face was pale. He bent down to retrieve the book, his hands trembling more than ever. As he reached for it, Chad's expensive sneaker shot out and kicked the book, sending it sliding across the polished floor. Gotta be quicker than that, shaky, Chad sneered. Leo froze, half bent over, the humiliation washing over him in a hot, suffocating wave. The laughter was a physical force, pressing down on him. He felt trapped, exposed, and utterly alone. And that was when Grace stood up. She didn't make a sound. She didn't call out a name. She simply rose from her chair with a quiet, unhurried grace that defied the frantic energy of the room. She placed her fork neatly on her napkin, pushed her chair in, and began to walk. Every step was deliberate. She crossed the cafeteria, her path cutting through the invisible lines of social standing. The whispers and laughter began to falter as people noticed the slight, blonde-haired girl moving with a purpose that seemed out of place in the high-stakes drama. She wasn't walking toward Chad. She was walking toward the book. She reached it, bent down in one fluid motion, and picked it up. She brushed a speck of dust from the cover before walking to Leo's table. She placed the book gently beside his tray. She didn't look at him, but he felt the solid, calming presence of her beside him. Chad stared at her, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. He had not accounted for this. The scholarship girl. The charity case. Who was she to interfere? What do you think you're doing? He demanded, his voice regaining its sharp edge. This doesn't concern you, Miller. Grace finally lifted her head. Her blue eyes were calm, steady, and held no trace of fear. She didn't speak to Chad. She spoke to Leo, her voice soft but clear enough to be heard by the now silent nearby tables. Are you all right? She asked. Leo could only nod, stunned that someone, anyone, had crossed the chasm to his lonely island. Her simple act of defiance, of kindness, was more infuriating to Chad than any challenge. It broke the script. He was supposed to be in control. I'm talking to you. Chad snapped at Grace. Get lost before you regret it. Grace turned her calm gaze to him. He wasn't bothering anyone, she said simply. Her voice was not accusatory. It was a statement of fact, and its simplicity was disarming. Chad's face twisted in rage. He felt his power slipping, his audience now watching with a new kind of anticipation. He had to reassert his dominance. He turned his fury back on the original target. You need a girl to protect you now, Vance, he snarled. He gave the table a violent shove. The flimsy table leg buckled. The tray tilted. The carton of milk, the sandwich, the apple, everything went flying. Milk exploded across the floor and splashed up, soaking the front of Leo's expensive school blazer. The cafeteria erupted. This was the climax they had been waiting for. Gasps turned into whoops of cruel delight. A dozen phones were now openly recording, their red lights like hungry eyes. Leo scrambled back, staring at the stains spreading across his chest. It felt like a brand, marking him with his own humiliation. Kyle, seeing his chance to contribute, snatched Leo's backpack from the floor. He unzipped it and, with a theatrical flourish, turned it upside down, shaking its contents onto the milky puddle on the floor. Pencils, notebooks, and a framed picture of Leo and his mother all fell into the mess. The crowd roared its approval. Chad puffed out his chest, the king once more restored to his throne. But Grace did not back down. She took a step, placing herself between Chad and the now trembling Leo. She didn't raise her fists. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, a shield, That's enough, she said. Her quiet certainty was like a spark in a powder keg. Chad laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Enough? We're just getting started. He shoved past her, his shoulder knocking her hard. He loomed over Leo, who had shrunk back against his chair. What are you gonna do now, Shaky? He taunted, his face inches from Leo's. Gonna cry for your daddy? He drew back his hand, not to punch, but to deliver a demeaning flick to Leo's forehead. It was a small motion, but it was the final line. Before his fingers could make contact, Grace moved. It was not a dramatic action. It was a simple, economic shift of weight. She stepped forward and to the side, placing her hand not on Chad, but on his advancing elbow. She did not push. She did not strike. She simply guided. Using his own forward momentum against him, she gently but firmly redirected the path of his arm. Chad, expecting to meet no resistance, was suddenly off balance. His feet tangled. He stumbled forward, his own lunge carrying him past Leo and into the side of the table. He hit it with a loud thud, his hip colliding with the metal edge before he sprawled awkwardly onto a neighboring chair. There was a collective gasp from the crowd. It was so fast, so quiet, so completely unexpected. It didn't look like a fight. It looked like Chad had tripped. Blake and Kyle stared in disbelief for a second before fury took over. Blake, the bigger of the two, let out a roar and charged, not at Grace, but at Leo, aiming a clumsy, sweeping kick at his legs. Grace pivoted. She dropped low, her body moving with a learned precision that seemed impossible for a girl her age. She didn't try to block the kick. She caught Blake's ankle in her hands. Again, she didn't pull or twist with aggression. She used his own momentum, lifting and turning in a single, fluid motion. Blake's body followed his leg. He was flipped, not with a violent slam, but with an almost gentle inevitability. He landed flat on his back with a loud whoosh of expelled air. The impact rattled a nearby tray, and a fork clattered to the floor. The sound of the falling fork was the only noise in the cafeteria. Silence. Absolute, profound silence. The laughter was gone. The jeering was gone. Every student, every teacher's aide, every eye was locked on the scene. They were trying to process what they had just witnessed. Chad was scrambling up, his face a mask of red-hot fury and utter disbelief. Blake was groaning on the floor, the wind knocked out of him. And standing between them was Grace Miller, her hands open at her sides, her breathing perfectly calm. She hadn't thrown a single punch. She hadn't uttered a single threat. Yet the two most feared bullies in the school were on the floor. She then did something no one expected. She knelt, carefully picking up the framed photo of Leo and his mother from the milky floor. She wiped it clean with the sleeve of her worn sweater and held it out to Leo. Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw not a warrior, but a protector. He took the photo, his trembling hands now steady. The spell was broken. A whisper started in the back. Did you see that? Another voice, filled with awe. She didn't even hit them. The realization rippled through the room. This wasn't a brawl. This was something else. This was control. This was discipline. Chad, desperate to reclaim his shattered pride, let out a yell and lunged at Grace again, his fists flailing wildly. He was all rage now, no thought, no strategy. Grace simply sidestepped. Like a dancer, she moved out of the path of his charge, her hand lightly touching his back as he rushed past. His own uncontrolled momentum was his undoing. He couldn't stop. He slammed into the wall with a loud thud, sliding to the ground in a heap. The cafeteria was no longer just watching. It was witnessing. They were seeing a fundamental law of their universe being overturned. The law that said might makes right, that cruelty was strength. Deep inside Grace, a memory bloomed. A dusty room smelling of old wood and sunshine. Her great-grandfather, Sarge, sitting in his armchair, his large, scarred hands holding hers. They make fun of me, she had told him, tears in her 6-year-old eyes. They say my dress is old. Sarge had looked at her, his gaze kind but firm. There are two kinds of strength in this world, Gracie. The loud kind, that needs to shout and push to prove it's there. And the quiet kind, that is so sure of itself, it doesn't need to prove anything. The first kind is a wildfire. It burns hot and fast and leaves nothing but ash. The second kind is a river. It's quiet, but it can cut through stone. He tapped her chest gently. You be the river, Gracie. Let their anger flow right past you. Back in the cafeteria, Her father's code, her mother's love, and her great-grandfather's wisdom all came together in that one quiet moment of stillness. She stood, not over her defeated aggressors, but as a guardian beside Leo. The main doors of the cafeteria burst open. Vice Principal Thompson stormed in, his face a thundercloud. He had been alerted by a teacher of a fight. His eyes scanned the scene. Two of the school's most prominent students on the floor, and the scholarship girl standing tall. He made an instant and incorrect calculation. "Miss Miller," he boomed, his voice echoing in the silent room. "My office. Now. You are suspended." A wave of protest murmured through the students. "She didn't start it," someone yelled. "I don't care who started it," Mr. Thompson declared, his authority absolute. "Northwood has a zero-tolerance policy for violence." Chad managed a weak, triumphant smirk from the floor. He had lost the fight, but it looked like he was about to win the war. But he hadn't counted on Amelia, a quiet junior who ran the school's newspaper blog. She stood up, her phone held high. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "You might want to see this first. I have the entire thing on video." She walked to the large monitor on the cafeteria wall used for announcements, and with a few taps, connected her phone. The entire room, including the stunned vice principal, turned to watch. The screen lit up. They saw Chad sneer. They heard his taunts. They saw him kick the book. They saw him shove the table. They saw Blake's attempted kick. And they saw Grace, never striking, never attacking, only moving with a calm, defensive grace that was impossible to misinterpret. The video showed not a fight, but a defense. Not violence, but protection. The silence in the room was now one of judgment, and it was not directed at Grace Miller. The truth, in high definition, was playing for everyone to see. And 100 miles away, in a sterile boardroom, a notification was about to flash across the phone of Harrison Vance. A notification that would shatter the world he had so carefully built and show him just how poor a rich man could be. Harrison Vance sat at the head of a gleaming mahogany table that was larger than most people's living rooms. The air in the boardroom was rarefied, filtered, and smelled of money and power. Around him sat a dozen of the sharpest legal and financial minds in the country, their faces a mixture of deference and ambition. They were finalizing a merger that would reshape the tech industry, a deal worth billions. Harrison's signature was the final piece of the puzzle. He picked up the custom-made fountain pen, its gold nib poised over the signature line. His world was one of numbers, of profit margins and market shares. It was a world of control. He could predict stock fluctuations, anticipate market trends, and dismantle competitors with cold, calculated precision. But the one variable he could never control, the one part of his life that was a constant, aching mystery, was the quiet sadness in his own son's eyes. Just as the pen touched the paper, his personal phone, a device that was sacredly silent during such meetings, buzzed once. A single, sharp vibration against the polished wood. Normally, he would have ignored it. His security protocols were absolute. Only one person had the ability to bypass the Do Not Disturb setting. The headmaster of Northwood Preparatory Academy. A cold knot of unease formed in Harrison's gut. He held up a hand, a gesture that instantly silenced the room. The executives watched, their billion-dollar discussion paused by the buzz of a single phone. Harrison glanced at the screen. It was not a call. It was a text message, an alert from a school-wide security feed he had installed himself. The system was designed to flag any unusual commotion, using audio and motion sensors. The subject line was stark, violence_flag, cafeteria. Beneath it was a link to a live video feed. Harrison's first thought was of a school-wide threat, an intruder. He tapped the link, his mind already calculating response protocols. The video loaded. It was shaky, filmed on a student's phone, but the image was clear. He saw the Northwood cafeteria. He saw a crowd of students. And then he saw his son. He saw Leo, small and cornered. He saw the spilled milk, the scattered books, the cruel, sneering face of a boy he recognized as Chadwick Pennington's son. Harrison felt a surge of cold fury. He watched as the boys ganged up on Leo, his son shrinking, his hands trembling. The sight was a physical blow. It was a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the part of his son's life he had never seen, the part Leo never spoke about. Then, a girl moved into the frame. A slip of a thing with blonde hair. He watched, his breath held, as she stood between Leo and the bullies. He saw her quiet defiance, her impossible calm. He saw her defend his son, not with violence, but with a grace that was both bewildering and beautiful. He saw her disarm boys twice her size without throwing a single punch. The video ended with the arrival of the vice principal and the girl being led away. Harrison stared at the black screen of his phone, but the images were burned into his mind. The boardroom, the billion-dollar deal, the expectant faces of his executives, it all faded into a distant, meaningless hum. He saw his son's face, not as the heir to his fortune, but as a lonely, terrified little boy. He saw the tremor in his hands, not as a minor medical issue, but as a target painted on his back. And he saw the girl, the housekeeper's daughter, the quiet girl he sometimes saw reading in his kitchen. She had shown more courage in those 2 minutes than he had seen in a lifetime of corporate warfare. A profound, suffocating shame washed over him. He had given his son a fortress of a home, but had sent him into the world without any armor. He had given him every material advantage, but had failed to give him the one thing that mattered, a father to stand beside him. The deal, one of the lawyers prompted gently, his voice pulling Harrison back to the present. Harrison looked down at the contract, at the line waiting for his name. The elegant curve of the fountain pen suddenly seemed obscene. He pushed the contract away. He stood up, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound that made everyone flinch. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. The deal is off. A collective gasp filled the room. Mr. Vance, his lead counsel began, his face pale. This is a $10 billion merger. We can't just. Watch me, Harrison said, his eyes like chips of ice. He didn't look at any of them. He was already moving toward the door, pulling his phone back out, his thumb dialing a number. Get the helicopter ready, he commanded into the phone. I'm coming down. Destination, Northwood Preparatory Academy. Now, he strode out of the boardroom without a backward glance, leaving behind a scene of utter chaos and confusion. The $10 billion deal was forgotten. The market could crash for all he cared. For the first time in years, Harrison Vance was not thinking like a CEO. He was thinking like a father. And a storm was coming to Northwood. Back in the cafeteria, the video clip ended, leaving Amelia's triumphant face reflected on the dark screen. Vice Principal Thompson stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. The clear, undeniable evidence had just dismantled his entire narrative. He had been ready to suspend the scholarship girl and make an example of her. Now, he was the one who looked like a fool. The students were murmuring, a low buzz of indignation that was growing louder. They had all seen it. Grace Miller was not the perpetrator. She was the hero. Mr. Thompson, Amelia said, her voice now bold. Chadwick Pennington and his friends have been bullying students for years. Leo Vance is just their latest target. No one ever does anything about it. That's true, another voice called out. A wave of agreement rippled through the room. The social fear that Chad had so carefully cultivated was beginning to crumble. Mr. Thompson, flustered, turned on Chad, who was now leaning against the wall, trying to look nonchalant. Mr. Pennington, is this true? Chad scoffed, though his usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a sullen defiance. She assaulted me. You all saw it. We saw you assault him. A freshman near the front countered, pointing at Leo. And we saw her stop you. The vice principal's face was turning a blotchy red. He was losing control of the situation. He knew the Pennington family. They were major donors. He also knew the Vance name. Harrison Vance was in a league of his own, a powerful and intensely private man. This was a political minefield. He made a desperate attempt to restore order. Everyone involved, my office. Now, he barked, pointing at Grace, Leo, Chad, Blake, and Kyle. The rest of you, back to your classes. No one moved. They were all watching Leo and Grace. Leo, who had been silent through the whole ordeal, finally looked up. He looked at Grace, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. For the first time in his life, he felt a flicker of something other than fear. He felt protected. He felt seen. He took a step toward her, away from the wall he had been pressed against. He stood a little taller. He uncurled the fists he had kept clenched at his sides. Meanwhile, in the head housekeeper's office in the Vance mansion, Susan Miller was folding laundry when her phone rang. It was the school. Her heart immediately leaped into her throat. It was the call every single parent dreads. Mrs. Miller, Mr. Thompson's strained voice said, there has been an incident. It involves your daughter, Grace. We need you to come to the school immediately. Susan's blood ran cold. An incident. The words were heavy with implication. Grace was the gentlest soul she knew. She was quiet, respectful, and never caused trouble. What could have possibly happened? Is she hurt? Susan asked, her voice trembling. She is not physically harmed, Mr. Thompson replied stiffly. But she has been involved in a serious physical altercation. We are discussing suspension. Suspension. The word hit Susan like a slap. Grace's scholarship, her one chance to escape the cycle of a life spent cleaning up after the wealthy, was contingent on a flawless disciplinary record. Suspension could mean expulsion. It could mean the end of the future Susan had worked so hard to build for her. She hung up the phone, her hands shaking for a different reason than Leo's. She grabbed her purse and ran out of the mansion, her mind racing. What had happened? Who had Grace, of all people, gotten into a fight with? It didn't make sense. It wasn't her daughter. It couldn't be. 30 minutes later, Susan hurried through the polished halls of Northwood, her sensible work shoes squeaking on the immaculate floors. She felt out of place, a simple woman in a world of privilege and power. She arrived at the vice principal's office to find a tense scene. Grace was sitting in a chair, perfectly calm, her hands folded in her lap. Opposite her, looking bruised and furious, were Chad Pennington and his two friends. Leo Vance was there too, standing awkwardly near Grace, a silent sentinel. Mr. Thompson was behind his desk, looking like a man caught in a hurricane. "Mrs. Miller," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Thank you for coming." Before he could continue, Chad's father, Chadwick Pennington too, burst into the room. He was a big man with a booming voice and the entitled air of someone who had never been told no. He was followed by his wife, a woman adorned in so much jewelry she jingled when she walked. "Thompson," Mr. Pennington boomed, ignoring Susan completely. "What is the meaning of this? My son was viciously attacked by this girl. I want her expelled. I want charges pressed." Susan felt her world tilting. Expelled? Charges? She looked at her daughter, who met her gaze with a calm, steady look that held no fear or shame. Mr. Thompson stammered, "Mr. Pennington, the situation is complex. We have video evidence that suggests—" "I don't care about your video," Pennington roared. "My son is the victim here. Look at him. This is what happens when you let riffraff into a school like this on charity." He waved a dismissive hand in Grace's direction. Susan felt a surge of protective fury. "My daughter is not riffraff," she said, her voice low but firm. It was the first time she had spoken. Pennington turned to her, his eyes full of disdain. "And you are?" "I'm her mother," Susan said, rising to her feet. "And I would like to know what happened before you start throwing around accusations." "I'll tell you what happened," Chad whined from his chair. "She attacked me for no reason." "That's a lie," a new voice said. Everyone turned. Leo Vance had spoken. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension in the room like a knife. "She was protecting me," Leo said, looking directly at Chad. "You were bullying me. You and your friends. You pushed me. You threw my things on the floor. She told you to stop, and you wouldn't." Chadwick Pennington too stared at Leo, momentarily speechless. He hadn't expected the Vance boy to speak up. He was known for being timid, a ghost in the halls. "Is this true, Chad?" he asked his son, his voice losing some of its bluster. "No. He's lying. They're both lying," Chad insisted, his face panicked. The argument was about to escalate when the office door opened again. This time, it wasn't with a bang, but with a quiet, powerful presence that instantly changed the atmosphere in the room. Harrison Vance stood in the doorway. He was not dressed in his usual tailored suit. He had thrown on a simple black sweater and slacks, but he radiated an aura of command that no suit could ever bestow. His eyes were cold and hard as granite. He didn't look at the vice principal. He didn't look at the Penningtons. He looked at his son. "Leo," he said, his voice softer than anyone in the room had ever heard it. "Are you okay?" Leo nodded, his eyes wide. He had never seen his father at school before. Not for a parent-teacher conference. Not for a school play. Never. Harrison's gaze then moved to Grace. He looked at the small, blonde-haired girl who had stood up for his son when he himself had been absent. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a quiet dignity. His gaze then fell on Susan Miller, the woman who polished his floors and cleaned his toilets, who stood beside her daughter with the fierce pride of a lioness. Finally, His eyes settled on Chadwick Pennington too. The two men were titans of industry, but they were not equals. Pennington was a loud, blustering man who inherited his wealth. Harrison Vance was a self-made predator who had built an empire from nothing. Pennington, Harrison said, his voice a low growl. Your son put his hands on my son. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, and it hung in the air like a death sentence. Pennington sputtered. Now hold on, Vance. My son was the one who was attacked. This girl. I have seen the video. Harrison cut him off, his voice dropping even lower, becoming even more dangerous. The video that is, as we speak, being uploaded to the school's servers and sent to the Board of Trustees. The video that shows your son and his friends tormenting a boy with a neurological condition. The video that shows this young lady. He nodded respectfully toward Grace, defending him when no one else would. The color drained from Pennington's face. The mention of the board, of the video, of Leo's condition being named publicly, it was a disaster. And then, Harrison continued, taking a slow step into the room. I hear you come in here, demanding that she be expelled. You threatened to press charges against an 11-year-old girl for protecting my son from your hooligan. He stopped directly in front of Pennington, who, despite being a larger man, seemed to shrink under Harrison's focused rage. Let me make something clear, Harrison said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it filled the room. If anyone is leaving this school, it will be your son. If any charges are going to be pressed, they will be against him for assault and battery. And if I hear one more word come out of your mouth against this girl or her mother, I will personally dismantle your company, piece by piece, until the only thing you have left is that ridiculous suit you're wearing. The silence that followed was absolute. Chadwick Pennington too stood there, his mouth slightly agape, his face a mottled patchwork of red and white. He had built his life on bullying and intimidation, but he had just come face to face with a master of the craft, and he had been utterly, completely outmatched. Harrison Vance had just declared war, and he had done it not to protect his company, but to protect his son and the quiet little girl who had shown him what real strength looked like. The shock in the room was palpable. They weren't just stunned. They were witnessing the world realign itself, right there in the vice principal's office. Chadwick Pennington too stood as if rooted to the floor, his face a canvas of shock and humiliation. The threat wasn't just about money. It was existential. Harrison Vance didn't just have more wealth. He had a different kind of power, the silent, predatory power of a man who had clawed his way to the top, not inherited a comfortable seat. Pennington's power was loud and brittle. Vance's was quiet and absolute. Without another word, Pennington grabbed his son's arm, yanked him from the chair, and stormed out of the office, his wife jingling in his wake. The door slammed shut, leaving a ringing silence. Vice Principal Thompson looked as if he had aged a decade in 10 minutes. He stared at Harrison Vance, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He had been moments away from suspending the daughter of his housekeeper and was now facing the unbridled wrath of the school's most powerful and now most terrifying benefactor. Harrison ignored him. He turned to Susan, his expression softening from granite to something approaching humility. Mrs. Miller, he said, his voice now quiet and devoid of its earlier menace. I am deeply sorry for what your daughter was put through and for what you were just subjected to. Susan, who had stood her ground with a quiet strength that mirrored her daughter's, simply nodded. My daughter did what she thought was right. Yes, Harrison said, his gaze shifting to Grace. She did. He looked at this 11-year-old girl who had faced down bullies and their powerful parents without flinching and felt a profound sense of awe. She possessed a kind of wealth he couldn't quantify on a balance sheet. You are a remarkable young woman, Grace. Grace didn't blush or look away. She met his gaze directly. Thank you, sir. But I only did what anyone should have. Her simple, honest words struck Harrison more deeply than any corporate negotiation. What anyone should have. He had been so busy building an empire that he had forgotten the simple, fundamental rules of being a decent human being. He then turned to his son. For the first time, he truly saw him. He saw the faint tremor in his hands, not as a defect, but as a part of the gentle, kind boy he had almost failed to know. He knelt, an action so foreign to him that it felt like his knees might crack. He put his hands on Leo's shoulders, bringing them eye to eye. Leo, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. I'm sorry. I haven't been there for you. I I didn't know. Leo looked at his father, at this powerful, untouchable man now kneeling before him, and saw a crack in the armor. He saw the grief and the regret that his father had hidden for so long. A single tear traced a path down Leo's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just nodded. It was enough. Harrison stood up and looked around the office, at the stunned vice principal, at the two families who were worlds apart, yet now inextricably linked. Mr. Thompson, Harrison said, his voice back to its commanding tone, but without the rage. The bullying problem at this school ends today. I will be speaking with the board. There will be changes. As for Grace Miller, any mark on her record from this incident will be expunged. In fact, she is to be commended. Is that understood? Yes, Mr. Vance, Thompson squeaked, nodding vigorously. Crystal clear. Good, Harrison said. He then looked at Susan. Mrs. Miller, please. Take the rest of the day off. The week, if you need it. You will be compensated, of course. Thank you, sir, Susan said. But I have work to finish. Her simple dignity was another quiet lesson. She was not asking for favors. She was a professional. Harrison simply nodded, understanding. He put a hand on Leo's back. Let's go home, son. As they turned to leave, Leo paused. He looked back at Grace. For a moment, the two children just looked at each other, an unspoken bond forged between them in the chaos of the cafeteria. Thank you, Leo whispered, the words carrying across the silent room. Grace gave him a small, genuine smile. You're welcome. The ride home in Harrison's sleek, black sedan was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than the one that usually filled the Vance mansion. It wasn't empty. It was full of unsaid things, of new beginnings. Harrison drove himself, having dismissed his chauffeur. He needed, to be alone with his son. He kept glancing over at Leo, who sat staring out the window, the framed picture of his mother held carefully in his lap. Harrison's mind was a whirlwind. He had spent years building walls around his heart, believing that providing for his son was the same as loving him. He had been wrong. So profoundly, devastatingly wrong. She was a brave woman, Harrison said finally, his voice raspy. Your mother. She would have been very proud of you today. Leo turned from the window. Why? You spoke up, Harrison said. In that office. You told the truth, even when you were scared. That takes courage. Grace is the one who's brave, Leo said quietly. Yes, Harrison agreed. She is. He paused, gripping the steering wheel. She reminds me of him. Leo looked confused. Him. Harrison took a deep breath. It was a story he hadn't told in years, a part of his life he had buried long ago. My father. He was a mechanic. Not a rich man. But he was tough. Honest. He always said, Harry, you can have all the money in the world, but if you don't have your good name, you have nothing. He stood up for people. He wasn't afraid of a fight if it was for the right reason. He had spent his entire adult life running from that world, from the grease under his father's fingernails and the smell of oil in their tiny apartment. He had built an empire to prove he was better than that. But in a school cafeteria, a housekeeper's daughter had shown him that his father's values were worth more than all his billions. When they arrived at the mansion, the silence felt different here too. It wasn't the cold, sterile silence of a museum. It felt expectant. Later that evening, Susan and Grace Miller returned home to their own small apartment. It was filled with the familiar comforts of a life lived with care, the scent of lemon polish, the sight of a worn but beloved armchair, the neat stack of books on a side table. Susan made them chamomile tea, and they sat together at their small kitchen table. She didn't press Grace for details. She waited. I was scared, Mom, Grace said finally, her voice small. When Chad came over. I was scared for Leo. I know. Honey, Susan said, her hand covering her daughter's. But you did the right thing. Great-Grandpa Sarge always said that courage isn't about not being scared, Grace recited softly. It's about doing what's right even when your knees are shaking. He was a wise man, Susan said, her eyes glistening with pride. And you have his heart, my love. You have his strength. She pulled the small wooden box from a nearby shelf and opened it. Inside, the metals gleamed dimly in the soft light of the kitchen lamp. She picked up a small, bronze star. He got this one for pulling two men out of a burning tank, she said. He never talked about it. He said the real medals in life are the ones you carry inside you. The moments you choose kindness over cruelty. The times you stand up when it would be easier to sit down. You earned a medal like that today, Grace. One he would have been very proud of. Grace looked at the medal, then at her mother. She understood. Her legacy wasn't one of wealth or power. It was one of quiet, unshakable integrity. And in that moment, in their small, love-filled kitchen, she felt richer than any king. The next day at Northwood was a day of reckoning. The video, as Harrison had promised, had been circulated among the school's board members. The Pennington family, facing public humiliation and the very real threat of Harrison Vance's corporate wrath, withdrew Chad from the school before he could be expelled. Blake and Kyle were suspended for a month and stripped of their positions on the school's sports teams. The social order of the school had been shattered. The whispers in the halls were no longer about who had the newest phone or the most expensive shoes. They were about what had happened in the cafeteria, about how the quietest girl in school had taken down the biggest bullies without throwing a punch, about how the richest, most powerful man anyone knew had torn up a billion-dollar deal to come to his son's side. Grace Miller was no longer invisible. Students looked at her with a new kind of respect, a mixture of awe and curiosity. But she remained unchanged. She still sat at the scholarship table with her friends. She still ate her homemade lunch. The only difference was that now, the seat beside her was no longer empty. Leo Vance sat there every day. Their friendship blossomed in the quiet corners of the school. They studied together in the library, Grace patiently helping Leo with his math, his hands seeming to tremble less when she was near. Leo, in turn, shared his world with her. He told her about the stars, stories his mother had taught him, pointing out constellations in the books they read. He learned about her life, too. He learned about her great-grandfather, the war hero. He learned about her mother's hard work and unwavering love. He saw that her small apartment, which he visited one weekend, was more of a home than his sprawling, empty mansion had ever been. It was filled with laughter, warmth, and the smell of baking bread. Harrison Vance watched the transformation in his son with a growing sense of wonder. The sadness in Leo's eyes was being replaced by a light he hadn't seen since his wife was alive. He saw his son laughing, talking, and carrying his schoolbooks with a new confidence. He knew he owed it all to Grace and her mother. But how could he possibly repay a debt like that? Money felt cheap, insulting. A simple thank you felt wholly inadequate. He began to observe Susan Miller not as a housekeeper, but as a person. He saw the quiet dignity with which she worked. He saw the tired lines around her eyes, but also the fierce pride she took in her job. He found himself making excuses to be in the kitchen when she was there, asking her questions about her day, about Grace. One afternoon, he found her in the library, carefully dusting the shelves. On a small table was the polished wooden box containing Sarge's medals. Grace had brought it over to show Leo. Harrison picked it up, his touch gentle. "May I?" he asked Susan. "Of course, sir," she said. He opened the box and looked at the collection of medals. The Bronze Star, the Purple Heart. Each one represented an act of incredible courage. "My father fought in Vietnam," Harrison said quietly, the admission surprising even himself. He never talked about it, but he had a box like this. "I haven't looked at it in 30 years. Grace's great-grandfather believed that a person's character was their true legacy, Susan said softly. The words hung in the air between them. Legacy. Harrison looked around the vast library, at the priceless first editions and the leather-bound classics. He had been building an empire, a legacy of wealth and power to leave to his son. But what was the character of that legacy? What was he really teaching Leo? He knew what he had to do. It was a plan so radical, so completely out of character, that he knew it would send shockwaves through his world. It was a decision that wasn't about profit or loss. It was about honor. It was about building a different kind of legacy. It was the decision that would, as the world would soon discover, stun everyone. 2 weeks later, the entire Northwood Preparatory Academy was gathered in the auditorium, buzzing with speculation. The biggest rumor, the one no one truly believed, was that Harrison Vance himself would appear. He did. He walked onto the stage and stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of young faces. In the front row sat his son, Leo, and beside him, Grace and Susan Miller, invited without explanation. "Good morning," Harrison began, his voice amplified yet deeply personal. "I'm not here to announce a new building. I'm here to talk about a debt." His gaze found his son. "For a long time, I believed a legacy was something you could count on a stock exchange. That my only job was to build a financial fortress to protect my son. I was wrong. He recounted the incident in the cafeteria of how his son was targeted for his vulnerability while he, the father, was oblivious in a distant boardroom. The fortress I built for him was a prison, he admitted, his voice raw. And I had failed to give him the tools to navigate the world. But someone else was there. Someone who had something far more valuable than money. Character. Courage. He looked directly at Grace. Grace Miller stood up. She did not use violence. She used discipline. She did not use anger. She used courage. She taught this school, and she taught me, a lesson that no amount of tuition could ever buy. He gestured to a small, polished wooden box on the podium, Sarge's medals. I've learned about Grace's great-grandfather, Sergeant Major Thomas Miller, he said. A decorated war hero. He believed a person's character was their true legacy. My company, Vance Industries, builds technology to protect soldiers, but we've lacked a conscience. A moral compass. Today, that changes. The room was utterly still. I am announcing the formation of a new, independent ethics oversight committee for Vance Industries, he declared. This committee will have unprecedented power to review, approve, or veto any project based on its moral and humanitarian implications. It will be the soul of my company. The statement was so radical, so completely unheard of, that a wave of stunned gasps swept the auditorium. This committee will be called the Miller Committee for Ethical Leadership, Harrison announced, his voice ringing with passion. And it will be established with a $50 million endowment in Sergeant Major Miller's name. This fund will support the committee's work, but it will also provide educational scholarships for students of character and support for veterans' families. He paused, letting the weight of the name and the number sink in. But a committee needs a leader. It needs a chairperson with unimpeachable integrity, someone who understands hard work, dignity, and the difference between right and wrong in their very bones. He looked at Susan Miller, whose face was a picture of disbelief, her hand covering her mouth. I have offered the position of chairperson of the Miller Committee, with a permanent seat on the board of directors of Vance Industries, to Susan Miller. The dam of silence broke. A wave of gasps turned into a thunderous, rolling applause that grew until the entire auditorium was on its feet. The students, the faculty, they were not just applauding a donation. They were applauding an act of profound, revolutionary justice. Susan Miller sat frozen, tears streaming down her face as she looked from her daughter, whose eyes shone with immense pride, to the man on stage. Harrison raised a hand for silence. He had one last thing to say. My son once told me that his mother used to say his hands shake because his heart is too big for his body, he said, looking at Leo with a father's love that was now, finally, on full display. I think the world could use a few more people like that. People whose hearts are too big for their bodies. People like my son. And people like Grace Miller. He stepped away from the podium and walked over to Susan, extending a hand. Not as an employer, but as an equal. After a moment, she took it. The applause was deafening. In the months that followed, everything changed. Susan, with Grace's unwavering encouragement, accepted the position. She walked into the Vance Industries boardroom, bringing a quiet, unshakable integrity to a world that had none. She was not an expert in finance, but she was an expert in humanity. And for the first time, the board truly listened. The Miller Committee became a force for good, redirecting the company's vast resources toward projects that rebuilt communities torn apart by war and funding scholarships for kids who, like Grace, had character but no cash. The Vance Mansion was no longer a silent museum. It was often filled with the sound of laughter. Grace and Leo were inseparable, their bond a testament to the idea that friendship sees no class lines. Harrison taught them both how to play chess, and more often than not, Grace, with her calm, strategic mind, would beat him soundly. One evening, Harrison, Leo, Susan, and Grace were sitting on the vast veranda, watching the sunset paint the sky. A comfortable silence settled between them, one that was not empty, but full of respect, affection, and a shared history that had started with an act of cruelty and ended in an act of grace. You know, Harrison said, looking at Susan, my father would have liked your great-grandfather. I think, Susan replied with a soft smile, they would have understood each other completely. Leo, his hands resting calmly on the table, looked at Grace. You never have to be a shield for me again, he said quietly. I know, she said, her eyes meeting his. But I always will be. And you for me. Harrison Vance looked at the two children, at the woman who had become his most trusted advisor and friend, and he finally understood. He hadn't just changed his company or secured his son's future. He had found his own humanity. He had learned that the loudest lesson often comes from the quietest voice. His legacy was no longer written in stock certificates and financial reports. It was written in the steady hands of his son, in the courageous heart of a young girl, and in the enduring strength of simple, human goodness. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.